we are currently in the middle of October, which is, for most readers, considered to be the Halloween and therefore horror reading month. Because of this, I've decided to do a video recommending some Halloween books to you all. Now, before I do, I just want to discuss a little bit about my preferences when it comes to reading horror-type books, because I would love to get some recommendations from you all. So if you have some, let me know them in the comments section below. But before you do, please know this. When I'm looking for a horror, I am looking for a horror that is going to horrify me. Different people will view horrors in different lights. Different people and readers can take in different amounts of horror. And we will discuss that as we go further along with the recommendations I'm giving you. But for me, if I'm going to pick up a horror, I want something that's going to creep me out, freak me out, gross me out, force me to leave the light on, convince me I'm going to have a nightmare, something like that. Because if it doesn't do that, then for me, it just feels like a boring read. So that's just my preference. But if you have a book that sounds like it's going to be right up my alley that's a horror, let me know in the comments below. But let's jump right on in, shall we? Here are some books that I recommend you read if you would like to read a horror this month or any other time of year. Let's begin. So the first horror that I recommend is this one, which is Cenote by Sean Horton. This is an adult horror that I absolutely loved. So yesterday, for memory's sake, in preparation for this video, I was going through all the horrors that I've read from the moment that I began my booktube journey, and a lot of them were duds for me, and it's because they didn't do what I was saying at the beginning of the video. They didn't creep me out, freak me out, convince me I need to leave the light on or that I'm going to have a nightmare or anything like that. And then I came across this book, and this book changed all of that. A selling point for this book is that it's a novella, so it's a very quick book to get through, but my gosh, does it have all of the creepy and freaky vibes. Oh my gosh, so well done. So, because it's a novella, there's not a lot I can tell you, but the basic premise of the book is that we're following a woman. I honestly don't remember her name. She's gone away on annual holiday leave from work, and she's in her final day of that holiday. While there, she met a guy, they started a romance, and for their last day before she goes home, they're taking a walk along this rocky cliff edge thing, and they fall into a cenote. A cenote is kind of like a cave that is filled with water, and it is almost always impossible to get out of. Not only is this a massive part of what makes it a horror, because our protagonist is really concerned that they may not be able to get out, because how the heck do you get out of an impossible situation? Normally, cenotes, impossible to get out of. But also, adding to this, they are not alone. And I'm not going to say any more other than that, but there's a great quote out there, which is that oftentimes when we fear certain things, what we fear is the darkness, because we can't see as well, so we don't know what's out there. And so that definitely added to the creepy vibes. It was fantastic. I gave it 5 stars. I highly, highly, highly recommend that one. The next book I'm going to recommend is this book, Into the Drowning Deep by Mira Grant. This is also an adult horror, and I gave this book, I believe it was either 3 or 4 stars. The reason that I gave it that rating is because I was a lot more specific back in the day with how I rated. Now I rate based purely on enjoyment level, and had I read this book today, I probably would have given it 4.5 or 5 stars. But it's important for you to know this is actually book 2 in a series. I did not know that going in. I thought it was a standalone, but that's okay, because you can still read it as though it were a standalone. So, in this book we follow a woman by the name of Tori, and her sister and a crew went out on this ship to see if they could find mermaids, and the crew never came back. So now Tori, along with a separate crew are going out there to see if they can locate the original crew and find out what the heck was going on, and also to see if they can prove the existence of mermaids as well. I just thought it was a fantastic read. Oh, there's also deaf representation in this book, and the deaf representation is done really well. So if that inspires you, I recommend it on that basis because it was done really well. The first half of this book read to me, the prose read to me like standard narration. The second half felt more like we were incredibly zoomed in to the mind and the internal goings-on of the protagonist. So if that doesn't bother you, then great. If it does, just please do have that heads up. For me, with a horror, I prefer to see what's going on outside rather than be totally focused on thoughts and feelings. But that does happen in this book. But I did love it overall, and I do highly recommend it. I will warn you, mermaids in this world are not the nice mermaids that we may know from Disney. They are evil mermaids. So do keep that in mind. But great book, and I do recommend. The next book I'm going to recommend, and these are in no particular order, but the next one I'm going to recommend may not to you be known as a horror. And that is because despite the fact that it was originally released as a horror, it has stood the test of time, and so it's now referred to as a classic. But because it was originally published as a horror, I am including it in this list. And that is this book, The Phantom of the Opera by Gaston Leroux. Okay, so some of you might be confused with me including this book on this list. Despite it being a classic and me having explained that, you might turn around and say to me, but Mr. Francy, even though I haven't read that book, I've seen the film or I've gone and watched the stage performance, and isn't it a romance? And my answer to that is yes, you're right. The film and the show are a romance. The genre is a romance, and that is because despite the fact that Gaston Leroux wrote the original canonical work, when Andrew Lloyd Webber purchased the rights to turn it into a stage show, he changed the genre into a romance to focus more on the romance. The original canonical work is not a romance, it is a horror, and that is very clear. While this book is a slow burn, as you get into the horrific moments, it is very clear to see that it's a horror and wasn't intended to ever be a romance. But I love it. The premise of this book is that we follow these two guys who have purchased an opera house in Paris, and on the first day that they show up to work, they find a letter that has been written to them by an OG known as the Opera House Ghost. Both guys are skeptical of this letter, so they basically throw it in the trash, and then things ensue. But it was an amazing read. I absolutely loved it, and definitely if you've either watched the stage show or the film, I highly recommend reading the book because you'll have more of an understanding as to why it is categorized as a horror. But it is so well done, and I need to read more Gaston Leroux at some point in future. So the next book that I'm going to recommend is this book, which is Misery by Stephen King. This is another adult horror, and I gave this an overwhelming 5 stars. My journey with Stephen King began in March of 2020 when I picked up Pet Sematary. I didn't like it. I understand the deeper metaphorical meaning that surrounds Pet Sematary, but it just wasn't for me. This book was 100% for me. So the basic premise of this one is that we follow an author. I have forgotten his name. Paul Sheldon. Okay. I think so. Anyway, we follow an author, and he has finished either part or all of a book that he's writing, and all of it, actually, and he needs to deliver it to the publishing company so they can look at it and whatever, and it is a very cold winter's day. The road is very slippery. He ends up in an accident and goes unconscious. When he wakes up in a bed in a house that he doesn't know, and a woman walks in and says, "Hi there, I'm your biggest fan." Yes, that's right. He has been, well, depending on how you see it, he has either been rescued or kidnapped by his crazy #1 fan, Miss Annie. I love Miss Annie. She's a wonderful villain. This story is just fantastic. It was everything that I needed. It is definitely a what do we call it, like a closed room or closed area type of horror, in that we're not gallivanting all around in different areas. We're just basically located in one home for the majority of the book. But I really, really appreciated it. I thought it was fantastic. Annie is a wonderful villain, and I do highly recommend this one if you're going to pick up a Stephen King. Now, what about those of you who are saying, Mr. Francy, I want to read a horror, but I'm scared? Don't worry, I haven't forgotten you. I'm going to turn you on to the Goosebumps series by R.L. Stine. I have the first 5 books here. Welcome to Dead House, Stay Out of the Basement, Monster Blood, Say Cheese and Die, and Curse of the Mummy's Tomb. And all in all, I loved most of them. I wasn't really a fan of the second one, to be honest. It just wasn't my thing, but I loved the rest of them. These are middle grade horrors. So if you're someone who wants to read a horror, but you're scared of reading horrors, but you want to read one, so you say that you've read one, Goosebumps is the best way to go. It is middle grade, so there is a line that can't be crossed, and they're all novellas, so they're really, really easy to get through. Highly recommend Goosebumps for those who fit into that category of a reader. And now to my final recommendation. This is the most recent horror that I have read, and it is either on par with Cenote for me, or it's that smidgen higher than Cenote. And that is this book, The Housemates by Ian Rob Wright. So, very quick way to explain the premise of this book is, imagine a crossover between the TV reality series Big Brother and the movie film series Saw. Cross those two over, and that's exactly what you've got in this book. We're following a guy by the name of Damien who enters into a Big Brother type competition. His reason for being there is because of the prize money. He has a best friend who has been there for him through thick and thin, but his friend is dying, and there is a cure, but the cure costs a lot of money. So that's Damien's sole reason for being there. Once Damien gets into the house, it seems very much like the Big Brother rules that we're used to, but there is a horror twist that has been put in place that everyone finds out about from night 1. And that lies in the competitions. Now, I don't want to say too much about this because it is so good that I honestly don't want to spoil. All I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a warning that this, not only is this book an adult horror book, but it is an adult horror book that crosses many lines that you couldn't cross with a YA or a middle grade. It is extremely horrific, extremely graphic, and extremely scary at times. But I love that. That's, as I said with my intro, that's what I look for with horrors. If I'm going to read a horror, I want a horror to do what I personally expect a horror to do, which is to gross me out, freak me out, scare me, force me to leave the light on, convince me I'm going to have a nightmare, all that sort of stuff. And while none of the books I've read so far have convinced me I'm going to have a nightmare, this one probably came closest to that, but it did freak me out and creep me out. So it was just so good, and I definitely need to read more Ian Rob Wright in future. But if you want a horror that's full-on horrific, this is what I recommend. But that is it. Those are the horror books that I recommend for anyone looking for a horror. Once again, I would love to get your recommendations for a horror, so do let me know in the comment section below, but make sure it is something that's going to scare me or creep me out, and not something that is just, as a friend of mine might say, stabby stabby and nothing else. But in the meantime, that is where I am going to leave it, letting you all go with peace, blessings, and so much love. Please do be kind and love one another, and spread your sparkling energy all throughout the world. And until next time, happy reading. Bye, everyone.